What happens when modern medicine fails, when rational thought collapses, and when desperate people convince themselves that the only cure for a curse is murder? Welcome to this journey into one of the most disturbing intersections of superstition and violence in American history. But before we descend into the Hex, haunted valleys of Pennsylvania Dutch country, I need you to ask yourself, where does faith end and madness begin? When does belief become dangerous? Tell us where you're watching from right now and whether you think desperation can justify the unthinkable. Because by the end of this account, you may question everything you thought you knew about the power of belief, the fragility of reason, and the terrifying things people will do when they're convinced they have no other choice. This episode contains detailed descriptions of violence, death, and superstition-driven murder. The details included serve understanding, not sensationalism, but they are disturbing. We present these accounts with profound respect for those who suffered and died. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. In the archives of York County, Pennsylvania, there exists a coroner's report from November of 1928 that reads like something from the 17th century, a death certificate, listing blunt force trauma resulting from ritual folk magic practices, not an accident, not a robbery. A ritual killing, a murder committed by men who believed, with absolute certainty, that they were fighting evil itself. We're about to delve into a mystery that destroyed multiple families, where one man's desperation transformed into a brutal act of violence so steeped in ancient belief that it became known as the last witch killing in America. This isn't just a story about the past. This is a question about how belief shapes reality, and how reality can shatter under the weight of belief. It was the year 1928. Charles Lindbergh had just flown across the Atlantic. Al Capone ruled Chicago's underworld, and America was dancing through the Jazz Age with unprecedented prosperity. But in the isolated farming valleys of York County, Pennsylvania, where the Pennsylvania Dutch maintained traditions centuries old, where powwow doctors still practiced folk magic, and where the old language and older beliefs persisted against the tide of modernity, time moved differently. And in that temporal suspension, in those mist-covered hollows where hex signs decorated barns and folk remedies competed with modern medicine, something ancient was stirring, something that would prove that civilization is often just a thin veneer painted over much darker impulses. York County, Pennsylvania, 1928. If you've never traveled through Pennsylvania Dutch country, you need to understand something fundamental. This isn't just a place. It's a pocket of time that refused to move forward, a landscape where the old world and the new existed in uneasy coexistence, where horse-drawn buggies shared muddy roads with Model T Fords, where German dialects still dominated kitchen conversations while English ruled the marketplace. The hills roll there, gentle at first glance, but deceptive in their isolation. Farms spread across valleys like islands, separated by forests of oak and pine that seem to absorb sound, creating a peculiar quiet broken only by the call of crows or the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer. The soil is rich, the kind that stains your hands rust, dread, and refuses to wash clean. It's good farmland, productive land, but it demands everything from those who work it. In 1928, this was a world where most families had lived on the same land for generations. German immigrants who'd arrived in the 1700s and simply stayed, their roots growing as deep as the ancient oaks that bordered their fields. They were prosperous enough by rural standards, but prosperity is relative when your nearest neighbor might be half a mile away, and the closest town is an hour's wagon ride on roads that became impassable seas of mud every spring. These were communities bound by language, by blood, by shared history, and by belief. Not just Christian belief, though the Lutheran and Reformed churches stood at the center of every crossroads village. No, there was something else here, something older that had traveled with the immigrants from the Rhine Valley and the Palatinate, a complex system of folk magic known as broch or powwow, a peculiar blend of Christian mysticism, medieval superstition, and practical herbalism that German settlers had practiced for centuries. And at the dark heart of powwow was the concept of the hex. To understand what happened in Hex Hollow, you need to understand hex belief with the seriousness it demands, not as quaint folklore, not as primitive superstition, but as a complete cosmological system that shaped reality for the people who lived within it. In this worldview, the universe was populated by invisible forces constantly at war. God and the devil, yes, but also a vast middle ground of powers that could be directed, manipulated, harnessed. Illness wasn't just biological, it could be spiritual, magical, inflicted deliberately by those who knew the dark arts. A cow that went dry, a crop that failed, a child who sickened without apparent cause. These weren't just misfortunes. They were attacks, and if they were attacks, they could be defended against or avenged. The practitioners of powwow occupied an ambiguous social position. Some were respected healers, men and women who could stop bleeding with a spoken charm, cure burns with whispered words, diagnose spiritual ailments that conventional doctors missed. They worked with prayer, with herbs, with rituals passed down through generations, recorded in treasured books like the Asterisk, long-lost Friend Asterisk, or Asterisk 6th and 7th books of Moses Asterisk, grimoires that contained everything from healing charms to protection spells to, whispered about but rarely spoken aloud, curses. But alongside the healers existed the hex masters, those who could inflict the very suffering others claimed to cure. Or so people believed, and in a world where belief shaped perception, where everyone knew someone whose cousin had been hexed, the threat felt absolutely real. Most people took precautions, hex signs painted on barns, those colorful geometric patterns that tourists today find quaint, served as spiritual armor, horseshoes nailed above doorways, mysterious objects hidden in walls during construction, small rituals performed at specific times. These were the everyday magics, the protective measures as routine as locking your door at night. But sometimes protection wasn't enough. Sometimes, despite every precaution, despite every counter, charm and prayer, the hex would land. And when it did, when you were absolutely certain that your suffering came from malevolent spiritual attack, what were you supposed to do? According to the old ways, there was only one solution. You had to break the hex at its source. You had to confront the witch. And if confrontation failed, if the hex master refused to lift the curse, well, that's where our story begins. John Blymire was 32 years old in 1928, but he moved like a much older man, hunched and cautious, as if the world itself might strike him at any moment. Those who knew him described a man of contradictions, intelligent but unstable, charming but paranoid, deeply religious yet obsessed with folk magic. He'd been born into poverty in York, the illegitimate son of a domestic servant. His childhood had been marked by illness, abandonment, and a string of foster homes that passed him along like an unwanted burden. But young John had discovered something that gave him power, that made him special. He had the gift. By his teens, Blymire had established himself as a powwow doctor of considerable local reputation. He could stop bleeding, cure thrush in infants, remove warts with a touch and a whispered charm. People sought him out. Something about their pulpansions PID him. For the prosperities FIR they'd already typed in his DI, FICULTLIFE, John Blymire mattered. He married, He found work as a cigar maker in York. He should have been content, but John Blymire was not a man built for contentment. Starting in his mid-20s, Blymire's health began to deteriorate in ways that baffled doctors. Terrible headaches that left him writhing in agony. Digestive problems that saw his weight plummet. Weakness that made even simple tasks exhausting. Depression that turned the world gray and lifeless. He consulted physicians who found nothing wrong, prescribed tonics and rest that provided no relief. But John Blymire knew what was wrong. He knew with the certainty that only belief can provide. He was hexed. Someone had cursed him. Someone with power equal to or greater than his own had targeted him with malevolent magic, and until that hex was broken, he would continue to suffer. The conviction consumed him. He lost his job. His marriage crumbled. His powwow practice dried up. What client wants a healer who can't heal himself? He became obsessed with identifying his tormentor. He consulted other powwow practitioners, seeking diagnostics. Some took his money and offered vague advice. Others refused to get involved. But in 1928, Blymire found someone who claimed to have answers. A powwow doctor named Nellie Knoll, known locally as the Witch of Marietta. Nellie Knoll didn't cure Blymire. Instead, she confirmed his worst fears and gave them a name. She told him exactly who had hexed him, who was draining his life force, who would continue to torment him until he took action. The witch's name, Nellie Knoll said, was Nelson Rehmeyer. If John Blymire was a man hollowed out by paranoia and suffering, Nelson Rehmeyer was his opposite, a figure of robust health, prosperity, and quiet power. 60 years old in 1928, Rehmeyer was everything Blymire was not: successful, respected, prosperous, and mysteriously healthy despite his advancing years. He lived alone in a weathered two-story farmhouse deep in the valley locals had long called Hex Hollow, a name that predated Rehmeyer, rooted in older stories of witchcraft and dark doings. The house stood isolated, accessible only by a winding dirt road that became nearly impassable in wet weather. Dense woods pressed close on all sides. It was the kind of place that accumulated shadows even in daylight. Rehmeyer himself was an imposing figure, tall, broad-shouldered, with a long gray beard and piercing eyes that seemed, to those inclined to believe, to see more than they should. He was a successful farmer, a widower who'd raised several children, a man whose property bore all the signs of prosperity in those years: healthy livestock, well-maintained buildings, productive fields. But there were whispers. There had always been whispers. Some said Rehmeyer practiced powwow, though he never advertised the fact. Some claimed he possessed books of dark knowledge, grimoires containing spells and rituals that went far beyond simple healing. Some insisted they'd seen hex signs on his property different from the protective symbols. Most people used symbols that suggested not defense, but offense. And then there were the deaths. Rehmeyer had been married 3 times. All 3 wives had died. His second wife had died young, suddenly, under circumstances that raised eyebrows. Coincidence, or evidence of something darker? The rumors grew in the retelling, fed by isolation, by the human need to explain the inexplicable, by the particular character of superstition in those valleys where belief and fear intertwined like roots beneath dark soil. By 1928, Nelson Rehmeyer occupied a peculiar position in the local imagination. Respected for his success, feared for his alleged powers, and isolated by both. He lived alone in Hex Hollow, tending his farm, bothering no one, seeking nothing from his neighbors except to be left in peace. But John Blymire was not going to leave him in peace. Hash the conspiracy forms Blymire didn't plan to act alone. The folk magic tradition held that breaking a hex required assistance, and besides, he'd become too weak, too diminished by his supposed curse to confront Rehmeyer by himself. He needed help, he needed believers, he found them. First was John Curry, a 14-year-old boy from a troubled home who'd fallen under Blymeyer's influence. Curry was impressionable, desperate for belonging, fascinated by Blymeyer's knowledge of powwow. Blymire had essentially adopted the boy, and Curry believed everything his mentor told him with the uncritical faith of youth. Second was Wilbert Hess, an 18-year-old farmer from a nearby property who'd known Blymire for years. Hess was different from Curry, older, more grounded, but also struggling with his own problems. His farm wasn't doing well. His father had died recently. His own health had been poor. When Blymire suggested that perhaps Hess's troubles also stemmed from Rehmeyer's hex, when he promised that breaking the curse would solve everything, Hess listened. Through the fall of 1928, the three men met repeatedly. Blymire explained the situation with the absolute certainty of the true believer. Rehmeyer had hexed him, hexed them all, really, since misfortune seemed to follow everyone in the vicinity of Hex Hollow. The curse was draining their life force, their luck, their futures. Medical doctors couldn't help because this wasn't a medical problem. Law enforcement couldn't help because the authorities didn't understand spiritual warfare. They had to take matters into their own hands. Blymire had consulted with Nellie Knoll, the Witch of Marietta, multiple times. She'd given him explicit instructions, derived from the old folk magic traditions, on how to break a hex. According to Knoll, there were three possible methods. First, obtain a lock of the witch's hair and bury it 6 feet deep. The hex would die as the hair rotted. Second, steal the witch's copy of the asterisk, long-lost friend asterisk, or other grimoire, and destroy it. This would break the witch's power. Third, and this was whispered, this was the dark option that Knoll allegedly mentioned only reluctantly. If all else failed, draw blood from the witch above the mouth and nose. The hex could not survive the drawing of the witch's blood. What Blymire heard in that final option, what he understood with the distorted logic of obsession, was permission. Sanction, a ritual solution to a spiritual problem. But first, they would try the peaceful methods. First, they would simply retrieve the book. On the evening of November 17, 1928, three men set out for Hex Hollow. John Blymire, age 32, who believed he was dying from a curse. Wilbert Hess, age 18, who believed his failing farm was evidence of supernatural attack. And John Curry, age 14, who believed everything Blymire told him. They believed they were on a mission of spiritual self-defense. They believed they were fighting evil. They believed they had no choice. They were about to commit murder. The road to Nelson Rehmeyer's farmhouse wound through dense woods that seemed to swallow the last light of day hours before sunset. On November 17th, with darkness falling fast and a cold rain beginning to fall, the three men, Blymire, Hess, and young Curry, walked that road with grim purpose. They'd brought rope. That detail is important. They'd brought rope before they ever knocked on Rehmeyer's door, which tells you something about their intentions, or at least about the possibilities they'd already contemplated. The farmhouse emerged from the gloom like a ship from fog. 2 stories of weathered wood, dark windows reflecting nothing, smoke rising from a chimney suggesting life within. A dog barked from somewhere in the property, a sound that echoed off the surrounding trees and died in the rain-soaked air. Blymire had been there before. He knew the layout. More importantly, he knew that Nelson Rehmeyer lived alone, that the nearest neighbor was too far to hear anything, that the road became impassable in heavy rain, effectively cutting the property off from the outside world. They were, in essence, about to enter a pocket of isolation where anything could happen, and no one would know until it was too late. According to later testimony, and we have extensive testimony because all three men would eventually confess, they arrived around 7 in the evening. The rain had intensified, cold and penetrating, the kind that soaks through clothes and chills bone, deep. When they knocked, Rehmeyer answered. Imagine that moment, an old man, alone in his farmhouse on a miserable November night, opening his door to find 3 rain-soaked figures on his porch. One he might have recognized Blymire, the failed powwow doctor, the others, strangers in the dark. What did Rehmeyer think? Did some instinct warn him? Did he hesitate before doing what rural hospitality demanded, inviting them in from the cold? The testimony tells us he welcomed them, offered them seats near the wood stove, asked if they needed food or shelter from the storm. Nelson Rehmeyer, whom they'd come to rob and possibly harm, acted with kindness toward the men who meant him harm. This is one of those details that makes the human heart ache, the innocent hospitality, the complete absence of awareness that these visitors had come with rope in their pockets and murder in their hearts. They sat in Rehmeyer's kitchen, a modest room lit by oil lamps, warmed by a cast-iron stove, furnished with the simple functionality of a man who lived alone. And they talked, or rather, Blymire talked. He later described attempting to bring up the subject of hexes obliquely, trying to determine if Rehmeyer would admit to his supposed powers. He spoke of his health problems, his run of bad luck, his suspicions that spiritual forces were at work. Rehmeyer listened, responded with sympathy, suggested Blymire see a doctor, mentioned some folk remedies that might help, completely innocent suggestions, the kind of neighborly advice anyone might offer. But to Blymire, this was confirmation. Rehmeyer was playing innocent, denying his powers, refusing to lift the hex. Every gentle suggestion, every expression of concern, Blymire interpreted as mockery, as the witch pretending innocence while continuing his malevolent work. The conversation continued for hours. Rehmeyer, hospitable and unsuspecting, probably hoping his visitors would wait out the worst of the storm before heading home. Blymire, growing more agitated, more convinced, more certain of what needed to be done. Hess and Curry, nervous, watching, waiting for Blymire's signal. At some point, the exact timing is unclear from the conflicting testimonies, Blymire made a request. He asked if Rehmeyer owned a copy of the asterisk, long-lost friend asterisk, or similar grimoire. This was the real reason for their visit, he later claimed. They'd come to steal the book, nothing more. If they could get the book, they could break the hex without violence. Rehmeyer said no, he didn't own such a book. He wasn't a powwow practitioner, he was just a farmer. This was probably the truth. Despite all the rumors, despite all the suspicions, Nelson Rehmeyer may well have been exactly what he claimed. A successful farmer living a quiet life, no more involved in folk magic than any of his neighbors. But to Blymire, this denial was the final proof. The witch was lying, refusing to cooperate. Forcing their hand, around 10 o'clock that night, the conversation ended, not with words but with violence. The first blow came without warning. Wilbert Hess, acting on some signal from Blymire, or perhaps just on building tension and belief, struck Nelson Rehmeyer across the head with a block of wood. The old man collapsed, stunned but conscious, blood streaming from the wound. Then Curry joined in. The 14-year old boy, later described as being in a kind of frenzy, grabbed another piece of wood and struck again. And again, Rehmeyer, 60 years old, strong but overwhelmed, fought back. He was a large man, powerful even in his age, and desperation gave him strength. The struggle that followed was brutal, chaotic, terrible. They grappled across the kitchen. Rehmeyer tried to reach the door, to escape, to call for help. Blymire, Hess, and Curry swarmed him. The rope came out. They tried to bind him. He fought. They struck him again. More blood. The sound of the blows, that terrible percussion of wood on flesh, on bone echoing in the small room. Finally, they got him down, got the rope around his wrists, his ankles, secured him to a chair. Rehmeyer, bleeding, gasping, pleaded with them. Asked what they wanted, what he'd done. Blymire told him, "You hexed me. You're killing me with your curse. We need your book. We need to break the hex." Rehmeyer, through pain and confusion, insisted he had no book. He wasn't a hex, master. He'd done nothing to anyone. Please, just let him go. But they'd gone too far to stop now. The moment Hess delivered that first blow, they'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. They were committed now. To burglary at minimum, to assault certainly, too. To what? What did they plan next? While Rehmeyer sat bound and bleeding in his kitchen, the three men ransacked his house. They were looking for the book, the grimoire that would contain Rehmeyer's power, that would prove his guilt, that would allow them to break the hex. They tore through drawers, rifled through trunks, pulled down boxes from closets. In their frantic searching, they destroyed property, scattered Rehmeyer's modest possessions, violated every corner of his private life. They found normal things, farming implements, personal correspondence, financial records showing that Rehmeyer, far from being a sinister figure, was simply a careful, somewhat prosperous farmer. Family photographs, a Bible, prayer books, but no grimoire, no asterisk long-lost friend asterisk, no asterisk 6th and 7th books of Moses asterisk. Nothing to suggest that Nelson Rehmeyer practiced any magic at all, dark or otherwise. This should have been the moment of revelation. The moment when Blymire and his companions realized they'd made a terrible mistake, that they'd assaulted an innocent man based on paranoid delusions and superstitious fears. Instead, it became confirmation of a different kind. If Rehmeyer had hidden the book so well they couldn't find it, didn't that prove how powerful he was? How cunning, how dangerous? The absence of evidence became, in their minds, evidence of guilt. They returned to the kitchen where Rehmeyer waited, bound to his chair, bleeding from multiple head wounds, struggling to breathe through what were probably broken ribs. He looked at his captors with a mixture of pain, confusion, and dawning understanding. He knew now. He understood what these men believed, and he knew, with the clarity that comes with mortal fear, that rational explanation would not save him. "I'm not a witch," he said, over and over, according to testimony. "I'm not a witch. I never hexed anyone." But they didn't believe him, couldn't believe him. Their entire framework of understanding, their explanation for every misfortune in their lives, depended on Rehmeyer's guilt. Around midnight, Blymire made a decision. They couldn't find the book. Rehmeyer wouldn't admit his guilt. The hex remained unbroken. That left only one option, the third method Nellie Knoll had mentioned. They needed to draw the witch's blood. What happened next remains disputed in the small details, but undeniable in its essential horror. According to the most consistent testimony, Blymire approached Rehmeyer with a piece of wood. Some accounts say it was a 2x4, others a piece of kindling. He struck Rehmeyer in the face, deliberately, above the mouth, trying to draw blood from the nose or lips, as the folk magic prescribed. The blow landed, blood flowed, but the hex, of course, didn't break. Blymire felt no different, no mystical energy dissipated, no curse lifted, because there had never been a curse. There had only been mental illness, physical ailments with natural causes, and the human tendency to seek meaningful patterns in random misfortune. But Blymire couldn't accept this. None of them could. They'd gone too far, done too much, to admit they'd been wrong from the beginning. At some point in the early morning hours of November 18th, the exact time is impossible to determine, Nelson Rehmeyer died. The official autopsy would later list multiple causes: skull fractures from the beating, strangulation from the rope that had been tied around his neck at some point, possibly suffocation from blood in his airways. But here's where the story takes an even darker turn. After Rehmeyer was dead, and they must have known he was dead, though later they would claim they thought he was merely unconscious, one of them had an idea: burn the house down, destroy the evidence, make it look like an accident. They gathered kerosene from Rehmeyer's own supplies, splashed it across the kitchen floor, soaked old newspapers, created a trail to the door. Young Curry struck a match. The flames caught instantly, fed by the accelerant, spreading with terrifying speed across the dry wood floor. Within moments, the kitchen was an inferno. They ran, all three of them, fleeing into the rainy night, leaving Nelson Rehmeyer's body tied to a chair in his kitchen, while fire consumed everything around him. The house burned through the night. By dawn, it was a smoking ruin, and that should have been the end of it. A fire in an isolated farmhouse, an old man dead in what might look like an accident, no witnesses, no evidence. But fire, as it turns out, doesn't destroy everything, and guilt doesn't stay buried as easily as the guilty hope. November 19th, 1928, the day after the murder. A neighbor, passing on the road and seeing smoke still rising from Hex Hollow, investigated and found the ruins of Nelson Rehmeyer's house. At first, it appeared to be exactly what Blymire and his accomplices had hoped: a tragic fire, probably caused by an overturned lamp or failed stove. But rural communities in 1920 knew fires, knew how they started, how they spread, how to read their evidence. And this fire felt wrong. The neighbor contacted the authorities. By afternoon, York County investigators were on scene, sifting through the still, warm debris. What they found would shatter any hope Blymire had of escaping justice. In the ruins of the kitchen, they found Nelson Rehmeyer's body, or what remained of it. The fire had been intense, consuming much of the structure, but certain details survived. The rope burns on his wrists and ankles. The position of the body, suggesting he'd been tied to the chair when the flames began. The skull fractures visible even through fire damage. This was no accident. This was murder, followed by arson to cover it up. But who would want to kill Nelson Rehmeyer? The old man had no known enemies, no apparent conflicts. He lived alone, bothered no one, kept to himself. The investigators interviewed neighbors and came up empty. Then someone mentioned the name John Blymire, mentioned that Blymire had been asking questions about Rehmeyer, mentioned the Hex accusations, mentioned that Blymire had been seen with two younger men in recent weeks. The investigators went looking for John Blymire. They found him on November 21st, just 3 days after the murder, at his boarding house in York. When the police knocked, Blymire answered the door calmly, almost as if he'd been expecting them. They asked him about Nelson Rehmeyer. Had he known him? When had he last seen him? And Blymire, in what must be one of the most extraordinary moments in the annals of American crime, confessed immediately, not with shame, not with remorse, but with the earnest certainty of a man explaining why he'd taken necessary action against a legitimate threat. "He hexed me," Blymire told the astonished officers. "I had to break the hex. He wouldn't give me his book. He wouldn't lift the curse. We had to draw his blood. It's the only way to break a hex." The investigators, Confronted with this bizarre explanation rooted in superstition they could barely comprehend, pressed for details. Blymire provided them with meticulous precision. He explained the folk magic beliefs, described consulting Nellie Knoll, named his accomplices, detailed the entire evening of November 17th. He told them about the attack, the binding, the search for the grimoire. He described striking Rehmeyer to draw blood above the mouth. He admitted to the fire, though he insisted they'd believed Rehmeyer was still alive, that the fire was meant to destroy evidence, not to kill. This last claim is almost certainly false. The evidence suggests Rehmeyer was already dead when the fire started. But it's worth noting because it shows that even in confession, even in his supposed honesty, Blymire was trying to minimize what he'd done. He wanted the authorities to understand this wasn't murder, this was self-defense, spiritual self-defense against a hex that was killing him. The police, of course, saw it differently. By the end of November 21st, all three suspects were in custody: John Blymire, Wilbert Hess, and John Curry. All three confessed, though with varying levels of detail and responsibility. All three would face trial for murder. The trial began in January of 1929, and from the first day, it was clear this would be unlike any other murder trial in Pennsylvania history. The prosecution's case was straightforward. Three men had brutally murdered an innocent farmer, then burned down his house to cover their crime. The evidence was overwhelming: confessions, physical evidence from the crime scene, the autopsy report detailing Rehmeyer's horrific injuries. But the defense had a problem. Their clients had confessed. They couldn't claim innocence. Instead, they constructed an argument based on the beliefs that had motivated the crime. Yes, their clients had killed Nelson Rehmeyer, but they'd done so believing they were defending themselves against supernatural attack. They were insane, temporarily made mad by superstition, mental illness, and the influence of folk magic culture. The trial became a bizarre spectacle. Witnesses testified about hex beliefs, about powwow practices, about the pervasiveness of folk magic in Pennsylvania Dutch communities. Experts in folklore and Pennsylvania German culture explained the long-lost friend the concept of hex, breaking, the traditions that Blymire had followed. Nellie Knoll, the witch of Marietta, was called to testify. She appeared in court, an elderly woman who looked nothing like the sinister figure her title suggested, and admitted that yes, she'd told Blymire that Rehmeyer had hexed him. Yes, she'd provided instructions on hex, breaking, but she'd never intended for anyone to be harmed. She was just following the old traditions, providing spiritual counseling. The prosecution tore her apart, showed how her diagnosis had been based on nothing on Blymire's paranoid descriptions, on her own prejudices and willingness to validate his delusions for a fee, demonstrated that her spiritual counseling had directly led to murder. But the most compelling testimony came from the defendants themselves. John Blymire took the stand and spoke for hours. He described his suffering in vivid detail: the headaches, the weakness, the feeling of being drained. He explained his powwow practice, his initial success, his decline. He testified about consulting doctors who found nothing wrong, which only proved to him that the problem was spiritual, not medical. He spoke about Rehmeyer with genuine belief. He was a witch. He hexed me. I know he did. I could feel it draining my life away. The jury listened to this educated, articulate man speak about hexes and curses and folk magic with absolute conviction, and they faced an uncomfortable question: was this man insane? Or was this simply what belief looked like when taken to its logical extreme? Wilbert Hess testified more briefly. He'd believed Blymire, trusted him, thought Rehmeyer had hexed his farm, killed his father, ruined his prospects. He'd been desperate and had followed Blymire's lead. John Curry, the youngest, was almost pitiable on the stand. 14 years old, clearly traumatized, he described following Blymire's instructions without fully understanding what they were doing. He'd struck Rehmeyer because Blymire told him to. He'd helped with the fire because the older men said it was necessary. The prosecution countered with brutal effectiveness. They brought Rehmeyer's daughters to testify about their father. A kind man, a good farmer, someone who'd never practiced witchcraft, who'd lived a quiet life and bothered no one. They introduced evidence showing that Blymire's hex was almost certainly a combination of depression, anxiety, and possibly physical illness, treatable conditions that had nothing to do with supernatural attack. They demonstrated that the search of Rehmeyer's house had found no evidence of powwow practice. No grimoires, no hex signs beyond the common protective symbols anyone might have, no ritual implements. Nelson Rehmeyer had been exactly what he claimed, a farmer, nothing more. And most devastatingly, they walked the jury through the actual events of November 17th. Stripped of supernatural justification, the crime was revealed in its stark brutality. 3 men had invaded an old man's home, beaten him to death, and burned his house down. The hex belief wasn't a mitigating factor. It was just the excuse they used. The jury deliberated for less than 24 hours. On February 8, 1929, they returned with their verdicts. John Blymire, guilty of murder in the first degree. Wilbert Hess, guilty of murder in the first degree. John Curry, guilty of murder in the second degree, the jury apparently accepting that his youth and subordinate role warranted slightly less culpability. The courtroom erupted. Blymire's mother screamed. Hess's family wept. Curry, 14 years old and facing life in prison, simply sat silently, as if unable to process what was happening. The judge, in pronouncing sentence, addressed the broader implications. This court recognizes that the defendants acted under sincere, if misguided, beliefs. But belief does not excuse murder. Superstition does not justify violence. We are a nation of laws, not hexes. These men took an innocent life based on delusions, and they must face the consequences of that choice. Blymire and Hess were sentenced to life in prison. Curry, given his age, received a lighter sentence with the possibility of eventual parole. As they were led from the courtroom, Blymire turned to the packed gallery and shouted, "He hexed me! He hexed me! Why won't anyone believe that he hexed me?" Even then, even facing life imprisonment, he couldn't let go of the belief that had destroyed his life and ended Nelson Rehmeyer's. The story doesn't end with the verdict. In many ways, that's where the real tragedy begins to unfold in its full scope. John Blymire served 27 years in Eastern State Penitentiary, one of America's most forbidding prisons. Inside, he became a model prisoner, quiet, cooperative, deeply religious. He conducted Bible studies, worked in the prison library. By all accounts, he found some measure of peace in captivity. But he never recanted, never admitted that the hex had been imaginary. In occasional interviews with researchers interested in folk magic and crime, Blymire maintained until his dying day that Nelson Rehmeyer had been a witch, that the hex had been real, that he'd done what he had to do. He was finally paroled in 1956, a 60-year-old man released into a world completely different from the one he'd left. He lived quietly in York, working odd jobs, attending church. He died in 1972, still believing, still convinced that his life had been destroyed by dark magic rather than by his own delusions. Wilbert Hess served even longer. He wasn't paroled until 1964, after 35 years in prison. He emerged a broken man, unable to adjust to life outside. He died within a few years, never having truly escaped the prison of guilt and regret. John Curry, the youngest perpetrator, had the most complex aftermath. Paroled in 1930, after serving just 5 years, he attempted to rebuild his life. He changed his name, moved away from Pennsylvania, tried to disappear into anonymity, but the story followed him. In 1958, a journalist tracked him down and convinced him to grant an interview. Curry, then 44 years old, spoke about that night in Hex Hollow with visible anguish. "I was just a kid. I believed everything Blymire told me, I trusted him, and I did something terrible. I've lived with it every day for 30 years. You don't get over something like that. You carry it." He died in 1976, having lived most of his adult life under the weight of a crime committed when he was barely old enough to understand its implications. Nellie Knoll, the Witch of Marietta, faced no criminal charges. Her spiritual counseling didn't rise to the level of criminal conspiracy, but her reputation was destroyed. She lived the rest of her life shunned by the community that had once sought her services, dying in obscurity in the early 1930s. And Nelson Rehmeyer, his daughters claimed his body after the trial. They buried him in a quiet cemetery far from Hex Hollow, away from the site of his death. His estate was settled, his possessions distributed, but his farmhouse, or what remained of it, stayed in ruins. Nobody wanted the property. The land where the last witch killing had occurred was considered cursed, ironically, by the same community whose hex beliefs had led to his death in the first place. For decades, the ruins stood as a monument to superstition's deadly power, slowly being reclaimed by the forest that had always pressed too close. The murder at Hex Hollow sent shockwaves through Pennsylvania Dutch communities. In the immediate aftermath, powwow practitioners faced new scrutiny. Some abandoned the practice entirely, burned their grimoires, distanced themselves from folk magic. Others went underground, practicing only in secret, trusting only the most reliable clients. The trial had exposed these private beliefs to public ridicule. Newspapers across the country ran stories about the witch killing, portraying Pennsylvania Germans as backwards, superstitious, primitive. The community that had tried to maintain its traditions against the pressure of modernization suddenly found those traditions being used as evidence of ignorance. Within a generation, hex belief, at least in its more extreme forms, had largely died out. The younger generation, educated in public schools, exposed to modern medicine and scientific thinking, rejected the old ways. Hex signs remained on barns, but increasingly as decoration rather than spiritual protection. The asterisk long-lost friend asterisk stayed on some shelves, but more as curiosity than grimoire. The Hex Hollow murder had accomplished what decades of modernization couldn't. It had shattered the credibility of folk magic by demonstrating its most horrific potential. But the story itself refused to die. It became legend, then cautionary tale, then historical curiosity. Books were written, documentaries produced. The ruins of Rehmeyer's house became a destination for dark tourism. People drawn to the site where Pennsylvania's last witch killing occurred. In 2007, investigators decided to excavate the site, hoping to find any remaining artifacts from that November night in 1928. What they found was simultaneously mundane and haunting: melted glass, charred wood, fragments of pottery. And in the cellar, preserved by the collapse of the upper floors, they discovered something unexpected: a small leather, bound book. Not the asterisk long-lost friend asterisk, not a grimoire, but a family Bible inscribed with the names of Rehmeyer's children and grandchildren, a record of births and marriages and deaths that had survived the flames that consumed everything else. The Bible was given to Rehmeyer's descendants. One of his great-granddaughters, interviewed about the discovery, said something that captures the profound sadness at the heart of this story. He was just a farmer, just my great-grandfather. He wasn't a witch. He wasn't magic. He was just a man who lived alone and got killed by people who couldn't tell the difference between their fears and reality. More than 90 years after Nelson Rehmeyer's death, certain questions still haunt the hollow where his house once stood. Was John Blymire mentally ill, or was he a sane man driven to madness by the superstitious culture he inhabited? The psychiatric experts who evaluated him couldn't agree. Some saw clear signs of paranoid delusion. Others argued he was simply a product of his environment, no more delusional than the thousands of other Pennsylvania Germans who believed in hexes. How complicit was the broader community in Rehmeyer's death? Nobody else physically participated in the murder, but the hex beliefs that motivated it were widely shared. If everyone in your community believes in witches, if everyone accepts the reality of hexes, if the culture provides specific instructions for hex breaking that include violence, can the community claim innocence when someone follows those instructions to their logical conclusion? What about the victims beyond Rehmeyer himself? Blymire, Hess, and Curry spent their lives destroyed by a crime rooted in false beliefs. They were perpetrators, yes, but they were also victims of a cultural system that gave supernatural explanations to natural misfortunes, that provided magical solutions to medical problems, that turned fear and ignorance into weapons, and perhaps most disturbingly, could it happen again? The specific hex beliefs of Pennsylvania Dutch culture have faded, yes. But the underlying psychology, the desperate search for meaning in suffering, the need to blame someone for random misfortune, the willingness to believe in invisible threats and magical solutions, that psychology remains universal and timeless. We just call it by different names now. The story of the Hex Hollow murder remains disturbing not because of what happened, but because of what it reveals about the human capacity to transform belief into violence, to mistake delusion for truth, to choose superstition over evidence, even when lives hang in the balance. 3 men destroyed themselves and murdered an innocent man because they couldn't accept that sometimes suffering has no meaning, illness has no villain, misfortune is random rather than directed. They needed their pain to make sense. They needed someone to blame, and they found him in an old farmer who lived alone in a valley unlucky enough to be named Hex Hollow. But questions remain, questions that echo across the decades. How many opportunities did the community have to intervene? How many people knew about Blymeyer's obsessions, about the hex accusations, about the escalating paranoia, and said nothing? When does cultural tolerance of belief become complicity in the violence that belief enables? Was Nellie Knoll guilty of anything more than providing spiritual counseling in the tradition of her community? Or does charging money to diagnose supernatural attacks carry a moral responsibility for what desperate people might do with that diagnosis? And what about the doctors who examined Blymire and found nothing wrong? In an era before modern psychiatry, before antidepressants and therapy, and the sophisticated understanding of mental illness we have today, were they equipped to recognize that his physical symptoms were manifestations of psychological distress? Did medical failure create the vacuum that folk magic rushed to fill? Perhaps these questions are meant to remain unanswered. Perhaps the not knowing is part of the story's power, the recognition that human behavior motivation, and responsibility are rarely as clear as we'd like them to be. To this day, the site of Nelson Rehmeyer's farm remains mostly undeveloped. Trees have reclaimed the clearing where his house stood. The road to Hex Hollow is still unpaved, still turns to mud in heavy rain, still feels isolated and wrong in ways that logic can't quite explain. And on certain November nights, when the weather turns cold and rain falls through bare trees, when darkness comes early and the valley fills with shadows, locals still avoid that road. Not because they believe in ghosts or hexes or the supernatural. Most will laugh if you ask them directly. But because some places, some stories, some memories are heavy enough to make even the skeptical walk a little faster, look over their shoulder a little more often, feel that prickle of unease that suggests the past is never quite as buried as we'd like to think. The ruins are silent now. The victims are long dead. The perpetrators served their sentences and passed into history. But the question remains, hanging in the air like morning mist in those Pennsylvania valleys. When does belief become delusion? When does faith become fanaticism? When does the need to understand suffering transform into the willingness to create it? If this journey through Pennsylvania's darkest folk magic tragedy resonated with you, if you find yourself thinking about the fine line between belief and madness, between culture and culpability, between victimhood and violence, then this channel has more truths waiting in the shadows. Subscribe if you're willing to explore the uncomfortable places where human nature reveals itself most clearly. Leave a like if this account made you question not just what happened in Hex Hollow, but what any of us might be capable of under the right or wrong circumstances. And in the comments, I want to know, where is the line? At what point does a community's shared belief system become responsible for the violence committed in its name? Could you have been John Blymire, convinced of your persecution, certain of your enemy, willing to do anything to break free from suffering? Or would you have been Nelson Rehmeyer, living quietly, unaware that someone else's delusions had painted a target on your back? Until next time, remember the most terrifying stories are the ones that force us to recognize ourselves in both the victim and the perpetrator, to see how thin the line really is between the person who suffers and the person who inflicts suffering. And sometimes that recognition is the darkness we're really afraid of. The hex was never real, but the murder was. And the question of why people believe what they believe, why they do what they do, why suffering demands meaning even when meaning leads to tragedy, that question remains as unanswered as the shadows in Hex Hollow, waiting for each of us to face it in our own way.